Tonight on Capitol Journal, more budget hearings at the State House reveal how state agencies are faring with less than a month to go in the fiscal year. State Finance Director Bill Poole discusses the state's new innovation efforts and offers an update on ARPA funds. Commerce Secretary Greg Canfield explains Alabama's economic incentive laws and what changes might be coming. And Senate Majority Leader Clay Scofield talks broadband to show where we are in getting high-speed internet to rural areas. It's all next on Capitol Journal. From our State House studio in Montgomery, I'm Todd Stacy. Welcome to Capitol Journal. Legislative leaders concluded their informal budget hearings this week. This series of meetings has featured state agency heads discussing their financial situations, including any problems they might be facing. This week featured the Department of Human Resources, the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and the district attorneys from around the state. DHR Commissioner Nancy Buckner shared some concerning struggles her agency is having with personnel. She says their biggest challenge is recruiting and retaining employees in these sometimes difficult jobs. The department overall has a 20% turnover rate, and specifically within the Child Welfare Division, they're seeing a 46% turnover rate. Buckner says competing wages from other employers and the dangerous nature of some of the jobs are key factors.
Had one we were going to hire, and Sherwin-Williams hired her out from under me. They were going to pay her more to test their paint than we could pay her as a social worker. This past year, I had a worker that was stabbed in the office. It's not uncommon if you get bit by dogs. If you're going out to people's houses, sometimes you don't see that dog that's on a chain that's under the house until you get on the porch. I had a worker that got bit by a 15-year-old young man. She had to go to the ER. She had so many bites and bruises on her. Have one that got slapped to the ground. Then you probably read about the supervisor that not just hit by a car by accident, but the guy backed up, was going to run over her. She suffered a lot of injuries. Some she'll carry with her for the rest of her life. And when you've graduated from school and you've never seen a baby die, it's traumatic.
Lawmakers said afterward that they would be looking into pay raises for those DHR employees in the next budget. Hiring and retention are also challenges for state prosecutors. Barry Matson of the Alabama District Attorneys Association said prosecutors throughout the state have a disproportionate caseload to attorney ratio. That's spreading district attorney offices thin throughout the state.
Circuit court, like I said, 64,000. District court, criminal. This is not district court property line. These are district court criminal. 142,000 cases, 17,000 juvenile cases, and 310,000 traffic cases. So that's 543,000 cases pending in 2020 in Alabama. I've got 278 full-time prosecutors. 278. I mean, when I go out in public and I ask, how many prosecutors do you think we have in Alabama if we have 65 or 80,000 felonies a year? And they say a couple of thousand. When I talk to my counterparts in other states, they can't believe two things: that we have 278 full-time prosecutors, and they can't believe that we have to go out and run a small business to fund our offices. They cannot understand that the DAs have to run a small business out of their offices to fund 70% of their operations, or that our caseload is 1,900 per prosecutor.
Matson's reference to small businesses there is because only 35% of a DA's budget comes from the state general fund, whereas the rest comes from court costs, fees and fines, and other local sources. Commissioner Chris Blankenship of the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources also presented before lawmakers. His agency is preparing for a major upgrade of state parks after voters approved a bond issue of up to $80 million to fund improvements. He took the opportunity to update lawmakers on all the various programs the agency oversees.
But we do have 21 state parks, about 48,000 acres around the state. We host about 6 million people, about 6.2 million people. We've seen that's about a 20% increase since the pandemic in the amount of visitations to our parks. As you see, we have 2 cave parks. We have 40 wildlife management areas that we manage, over 700,000 acres. We have 12 shooting ranges around the state. We have 20 community archery parks. We lead the country in archery parks. I think the next closest state is Kentucky, and they have about 10. We have 23 public fishing lakes. We manage more than 150 boat ramps, both in the fresh and salt waters. Alabama has the largest number of aquatic species in the United States. And then in Alabama, we have the largest artificial reef program in the country. Really, we have the largest artificial reef program in the world.
This budget meeting was the last work in the State House for a longtime Alabama lawmaker who is leaving after a career spanning almost 50 years. State Representative Lynn Greer said it's bittersweet to be retiring, but that the state is in better financial shape than he's ever seen.
Well, it's kind of tough to face because I've enjoyed it down here, and I've tried to do the best I could and pass some good legislation, some we couldn't pass, But state of Alabama right now, I've been on the General Fund Budget Committee for a number of years, and we in better shape financially than we've been in some time, so I'm glad with that.
When did you first get elected?
1974, I came and served a couple terms. Then I went to the Alabama Public Service Commission, served 9 years, and came back in 2002 and served a term and dropped out and came back in 2010 and been here ever since. So,
some good news on the education front. Alabama student test scores on reading, math, and science are up across the board compared to last year. State Superintendent Eric Mackey announced the improved scores at a state school board meeting this week. The Alabama Comprehensive Assessment Program from the spring shows math scores improved in all grades tested, with 30% overall students meeting proficiency. You can see that the proficiency drops from grade to grade as you go up. 50% of students were proficient in English language arts, which is a 3% increase from 2021. In science, the overall proficiency rate for the state increased by 4% for a total of 36% of students considered proficient. Mackey also noted that while the scores are headed in the right direction, the low proficiency numbers show much more work is needed to improve student learning. Public libraries can play a key role in preparing students for school and supporting their learning while in school. The Alabama Public Library Service recently trained 86 librarians in an education program specifically for that purpose. Capital Journal's Karen Goldsmith has the story.
The Alabama Public Library Service received a grant to participate in the Reimagining School Readiness Initiative. Its purpose is to help librarians, who in turn help families prepare children ages 0 to 8 for success in school life.
The project was originally conceived by the Bay Area Discovery Museum in San Francisco, California, and it was based on some research that they did. They're very research-driven organization.
Their research yielded 6 key findings split into 3 categories that they conclude matter most for a child's success:
Talk and play, body and brain, and science and math.
From there, a free toolkit of multiple activities was developed and librarians were trained. Gail Sheldon explains how a librarian may use the Reimagining School Readiness concepts to spark learning.
For instance, story hour. Story hour is something that all libraries do, and that these concepts can be added into story hour very easily. Reading a book and what do you think's going to happen next? And to see their eyes and their brain starts to move, and their parents pick up on these kind of things through watching their children. And then if you've got a repetitive phrase, I always let them know in the beginning, okay, when I stop, you're going to say that phrase, so it makes them stop and remember.
The toolkit includes posters to help parents start conversations with their kids from as young as age 0 to age 8.
Tell me more about your drawing. You know, instead of saying, oh, you painted the sky green. You know, tell me about your drawing. Tell me what you did. tell me why you used what you did, and let the child communicate that to you. It's making it so things are more child-directed instead of parent-directed.
86 Alabama librarians have received the Reimagining School Readiness Training. To find out if there's one near you, contact the Alabama Public Library Service at 1-800-723-8459. For Capital Journal, I'm Karen Goldsmith.
State and local leaders broke ground this week on the Birmingham Recovery Center, which will help serve those with substance abuse issues in the area. Mental Health Commissioner Kim Boswell said this recovery center and others like it will make a big difference for caring for those dealing with substance issues.
Really, the governor and the state legislature have really invested in substance use services. So for the first time since 1970, we've been able to expand our substance use treatment programs for those who have no ability to pay. And so we're really excited to see that expansion and to see the great work that's going on in Birmingham.
The race to the bottom to provide the lowest cost and highest volume services does not lead the way to lasting healing and change. If we all do better, then the standard of care gets raised for everyone. And with these 3 new facilities, treatment just got better in the state of Alabama.
The general election is just 60 days away, and Alabama is preparing by trying to recruit and train poll workers. Capital Journal's Randy Scott has more.
We put out a APB to make sure that people knew that we needed poll workers.
The nation and Alabama Secretary of State are looking for people to take up the call of being poll workers. In this case, for Alabama's 1,980 polling sites.
They check the voters in when they come to the polling site. They check their ID and make sure that that individual is the individual that's reflected on that qualified voter ID. And then they check where they're supposed to get a particular ballot for a particular area to vote in the jurisdiction where they live.
Making sure voting runs smoothly and citizens get a fair chance to cast their ballots is a top job for the Secretary of State's office. To get that done, the Secretary is putting out a call around the state for more poll workers to help keep voting on track.
Well, a poll watcher is an individual who is trained and compensated for working the elections at the local level in each one of our 1,980 polling sites on Election Day.
Secretary Merrill says probate judges will help bring new poll workers into the system. He adds, thanks to legislation passed a few years ago, more people will have a chance to serve. You can find contacts for the Secretary of State and those probate judges at www.alabamavotes.gov.
And in 2019, before we even knew that the COVID was going to come into existence, we had passed legislation to enable 16 and 17-year-olds to work at the polls. That's still in place today, and it is in place permanently.
For Capital Journal, I'm Randy Scott.
And we'll be right back with tonight's guests.
You can watch past episodes of Capital Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capital Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capital Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capital Journal podcasts. Keep up with what's happening with Capital Journal.
Next, I'm joined by Bill Poole, Finance Director for the state of Alabama. Bill, thanks for coming on the show.
Sure. Thank you, Todd. Good to see you.
Lots of things I want to talk to you about. You're Finance Director, so you wear many hats. One of those hats is being the chairman of the Alabama Innovation Corporation. This, of course, was born out of legislation 2 or 3 years ago. The idea being to encourage innovation, entrepreneurship. And just last week, y'all announced that the first of these grants, the innovation grants that have gone out. Walk me through how we've gotten to here with the Alabama Innovation Corporation?
Well, I think it's really an exciting and kind of transformative opportunity for Alabama. We know that the economic trajectory of the nation and the world is changing, and we know it's going to become more technology-driven, research-driven, and knowledge-based driven. I mean, that's just kind of an undisputed fact, I think. So what we need to accomplish in Alabama is sustain a lot of the fantastic things we've accomplished from an economic development standpoint and continue on that trajectory. But we also need to make sure we're diversifying and addressing those economic opportunities, which are opportunities for growth in Alabama. Every part of the state, urban, rural, north, south, east, west, we have a lot of activity, we have a lot of assets. So Governor Ivey had the foresight a couple of years ago to form the Innovation Commission. She brought together public and private sector leaders and tasked that group with studying and evaluating our innovative sector of our economy and identifying what are our strengths and what are our weaknesses and where are our opportunities, and make recommendations. That commission issued its report, and that then resulted in a variety of legislation that I think the legislature, I'm very pleased and excited, really embraced, recognizing this is an important avenue for Alabama. So the Innovation Corporation was established to really create the permanent entity. It is a first of its kind in Alabama public-private partnership. There is some baseline funding that's been established to begin this effort, and it's a very exciting effort. There are a lot of priorities. It speaks to growth in that area, but it speaks to the things that are also just important for Alabama from an economic standpoint. One thing that came up continuously was availability and accessibility of outdoor recreation to recruit and retain talent in Alabama, retaining more graduates, whether those are high school 2-year or 4-year graduates in the state, having job opportunities in these sectors that are attractive so that our best and brightest don't have to move to Atlanta or Dallas or Tampa or Orlando for jobs. They can stay here in Alabama. We can recruit companies. So the overall objective is to advance our economy into those areas, and we have assets all over the state. We need to really harness those, be strategic about those, and implement policy and pursue those very intentionally. And I think we're on our path to really getting started on that. It's very exciting.
So this first round of grant recipients, these were 30 small businesses throughout the state. They received grants of up to $250,000. What was the commission or the corporation looking for in candidates to receive these grants?
So this was a first round of grant awards, and so we were very excited about it. And we issued $4.5 million in grants, and I'll speak to some of the specifics of those. But what was really exciting was we saw applications far outstrip available funds. So what that tells us is here in Alabama, we have a lot of companies, small entrepreneurial startup technology, all over the state that are engaged in really cutting edge research. A lot of these we didn't really even fully know about, but we're bolting onto a federal program. So there is a federal SBIR, and that's the Small Business Innovation Research Grant, and the SBTTR, the Small Business Technology Transfer. So we're providing state funds in addition to federal grant funds. A number of other states have done this. This is groundbreaking for us. Some of our sister states in the Southeast are doing this, but this helps our small businesses who have scientifically proven, peer-tested, commercially viable, emerging technology concepts that have been tested. These are viable. It lets them be competitive here in Alabama as it relates to other companies around the Southeast. It makes Alabama an attractive place for these companies to be as opposed to moving their headquarters or locations to other states. And we saw a variety of exciting companies that are engaged in these technologies. 30 businesses awarded grants. 9 of those were minority or women-owned businesses. The Innovate Alabama will have another round of $5 million worth of grants for FY23. That opens next month, the fiscal year, that we will not award them that quickly. But we will have another round of these grants available. So companies that are in phase 1 or phase 2 of their processes can apply. They can go to innovatealabama.org to learn more about it, but we want to make sure these small businesses know about this opportunity. We want to help them grow their businesses in Alabama.
Mm-hmm. Like you said, 30 companies, too many for me to list out right here, but we'll put the link on on the screen so people can access it. Some really interesting companies. I mean, just reading about their backgrounds. So
fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, cutting edge emerging technology in all types of sectors. It's hard to really summarize or say a lot of them are doing this or that. It was really exciting to see these applications, to know that kind of effort is occurring inside of Alabama.
Yeah, that is exciting. I appreciate the explanation, and seems like a worthwhile effort. Switching gears real quick, I wanted to get an update from you on ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act, the first tranche of which was appropriated this past year. I know that y'all had a committee meeting, the oversight committee meeting, and you could sort of update the legislature on, the allocation of these funds. But that was like a month ago.
Mm-hmm.
Where are we now? How much of those funds, the first round of funds, have been allocated so far?
So I'm going to use round numbers, but the legislature appropriated approximately $600 million, which was the final balance of the first tranche, which is the federal terminology. And we have substantially dispersed those funds as it relates to round one. The healthcare funds have been dispersed to hospitals. The rural hospital grants have been dispersed to the hospitals. First responder, volunteer fire department grants have been dispersed to the end users. The broadband funds and the water and sewer funds were large amounts. Those are big awards are being announced on the water and sewer side. We think that will accelerate. ADEM is administering that. They are coupling in some other federal funding, so we're seeing a lot of awards on the water and sewer side. Those are infrastructure projects. You install those, and they last for decades. They serve our citizens. They facilitate economic growth. They facilitate sanitary water and sewer. So those are good. We'll see those continue to administer. We have a couple of small amounts of funds that we're winding down to the end users. We should have that complete within the next 30 to 60 days. So I'm pleased we really got the funds, deployed the funds into the field very quickly. I think appreciate the legislature's approach to these disbursements and the governor's leadership. The governor made clear we need to invest these dollars in investments that matter and last and create a return, not just in a whimsical way. These are one-time funds, and we need to invest them wisely. I think these have been very wise investments. We have some exciting, I think very exciting announcements on the horizon, particularly on the broadband front, and it will be a big first step that will, I think, foreshadow some next steps and put us in a good place in that regard. So I think that Alabama has handled these funds very wisely to this point. I'm very pleased with the progress.
Now, these federal funds, part of that law said it had to be spent by 2026, correct?
That's right.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, in the grand scheme of things, that's not that long. I mean, it may seem kind of far off, but when you talk about these infrastructure projects and just the scope of them, that's going to be here before you know it. Are you worried at all that Alabama won't have time to spend these funds? And if so, is it worth asking Congress to extend the deadline?
So we are cognizant of the timelines. We are concerned and aware about them. We are not worried at this point in time. Now, as the second round of ARPA funds are administered by the state, those timelines will become more acute, and the investments that will be more challenging as it relates to the supply chains and the availability of not only the supply component but also the labor component is the broadband side and the water and sewer side. If you think about water and sewer, you've got to engineer your project. That takes time. Then you've got to contract. We got to go through the public works process. You got to contract for the work and the supply. So those take time. They're complicated. And the other thing to note, which I think underscores your question, a lot of states are spending their ARPA money on broadband and water and sewer. So it's hard to get supplies. Inflationary costs are also, we are worried about inflationary costs. We will not be able to buy with these dollars tomorrow or next year what we could have bought with these dollars 2 years ago. But we can't change the inflationary circumstances, and we have to operate with the funds under the timelines as dictated by the U.S. Congress, and we will do that.
I know it's probably too early to talk about the next tranche. At least that's what everybody keeps telling me, that it's too early to talk about the next tranche of ARPA funds. But one thing I took away from that meeting, that oversight meeting, was that even though this historic amount of money going towards water and sewer, there's still a lot of demand out there beyond what that. Do you expect that to be one of the? Going forward into the second round, more water and sewer projects?
I certainly think that's on the table, and I think it's got to be very strongly considered because requests far outstripped available funds, even with these very significant amounts of one-time funds. It is pretty shocking. You have high growth areas that have big needs. You have just current communities that need upgrades. They have old systems, their treatment plants and pump stations that are aging. Then you have a lot of rural areas that, with a more sparse population, have difficulty financing their projects. We have areas, particularly in the Black Belt, that the soil won't perk. So the typical septic system approach doesn't work in those soils. That creates a lot of challenges, and that's where we have our most acute sewer issues. Clean water is not as challenging, but the clean sewer discharge is challenging, particularly in those rural areas. So the demands are very substantial, the projects are complex, and they're expensive. And so I certainly do hope that we continue to focus, because again, those are investments that last. They last for decades, if not generations, and they're the backbone of, if you don't have clean water and you don't have sewer, you don't have economic development, you don't have quality of life, all those things that we often take for granted, but we have to upkeep those systems. And so I think between water and sewer and broadband, I hope we see a real continued targeted focus on those, as well as healthcare issues will obviously be on the forefront as well as a variety of other issues that will be considered.
While I have you, I wanted to ask quickly about prisons. Was at the meeting where the bond sale went through. The state didn't get as much on that sale as maybe the state had wanted, but you said it was enough, at least to get started. Walk me through that. Is it the kind of situation where the state would go back to market to get more of that financed, or are we okay with what it is?
We are very comfortable with our current position in terms of moving forward with the 2 prison projects. And I want to state very clearly, the state's going to move forward on both of those. We have sufficient project funds to move forward for at least 2 to 3 years. We will need to secure some additional financing. We're dialing that number in. It's hard to get cost estimates pinned down, so those are some moving targets at the moment as some of the designs are finalized and estimates and contractors lined up. So we will need some additional financing. It's a difficult market right now. Look at the markets, whether it's the stock market. There's a lot of challenges out there. Rates are moving around. And so in the case of the longer term debt that we needed to secure in order for the financing, there's struggles. That's difficult in the market right now. And that's by and large why we came up a little short on that initial financing effort. But I'm confident we'll be able to close that financing gap. But we're not in a rush. We're not in a panic. There's no reason to be concerned at this point. We have over $1 billion of project funds at present. So we're in a very good position to take our time and make sure that we handle the financing, the pricing, to keep these projects on time and under budget and financed fully. And those are the 3 objectives. We're determined to accomplish all 3.
Okay, lots of different topics. Really appreciate you coming in and updating us on all of them.
Sure. Thank you, Todd.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capital Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org. Click on the online video tab on the main page. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page. You're watching Alabama Public Television.
Next, I'm joined by Greg Canfield, Alabama's Secretary of Commerce. Mr. Secretary, thanks for coming on Capital Journal.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
A few weeks ago, we covered this hearing here in the State House where a special committee has been looking at the state's economic incentives laws. I know these, at least a couple of these laws they're up for reauthorization in this coming session. Before we kind of get into the details of that, can you kind of give our viewers an overview of how these economic incentive laws work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is important to note that This joint legislative committee on incentives has really been delving pretty deeply into the whole issue, particularly of the Alabama Jobs Act incentives and our Growing Alabama program. That's not the only oversight that we have, though. We also, twice a year, provide a report first to a joint legislative committee on oversight, and that's something we do each and every year, as well as every year providing an incentive report that goes to the Legislative Services Agency. So a lot of oversight in our incentives, and I think that's a good thing. The way our programs work, probably I need to give a little history.
Sure.
When I first came into this position 11 years ago, the incentive tools for the state of Alabama for project activity, for job creation, and the tracking and recruitment of investment into the state kind of looked like this. We borrowed a lot of money. We had to issue bonds. We used those borrowed funds to provide grants to these companies, and we used something called the capital income tax credit, which would statutorily provide any company without any oversight at all, other than through tax law, to be able to recover over 20 years up to 100% of their capital investment. We just didn't think that was a sustainable approach to incentivizing job creation in the state. So we looked to change that, and we did. We created a more sustainable approach. It's more pay-as-you-go. And what I mean by pay-as-you-go is we create new revenue streams when companies invest new capital into the state. They create new jobs in the state, and that new payroll helps lift the wages of the average Alabamian across the state. And we return a small portion of that back as an incentive after the state has received the new revenues into our state treasury. It's a much more responsible way. It also dramatically reduces how much borrowing we have to do. We actually reduce the amount of borrowing by about 70%, which is significant. So the way it works is this. Our two primary tools under the Alabama Jobs Act is something called the jobs credit and then something called the investment credit. And what we did was we reduced our dependency on borrowing, and we got rid of that 100% income tax credit, and we replaced it with two things. The first is the jobs credit. It's a payroll-based credit that provides companies with the ability, as they create new jobs and the state collects 12 months of payroll taxes, at the end of that time, we return about 3% of that payroll back to the company as an incentive, and it comes to them in the form of cash. So it's valuable to the companies. But again, we're collecting new revenues that these projects are creating and then returning a small portion of the new revenue stream back to them as an incentive. The other thing that we did when we replaced that 100% recapture of an investment through what was called at the time the capital credit, we replaced it with something called the investment credit. And what the investment credit does is allow a company to get a income tax incentive and an incentive against their other taxes for utility taxes and things like that. But we dramatically reduced the amount that they could recover down to 15%, not 100%, but 15%, and able to recover that at usually the amount that's capped at 1.5% per year for up to 10 years. It's a much more sustainable approach. It is pay-as-you-go. It's allowed us to remain competitive, and I think our performance has proven that. Hopefully you'll ask me about our performance.
Well, yeah, and before we get to it, I remember during that meeting, you had some charts basically showing Alabama versus other states.
Yeah.
Before the tax incentives were included and then after, and it seemed like that when you added the tax incentives, not just tax, but the economic development incentives, then we were competitive with other states. But when you took them away, maybe we weren't, based on some of our neighboring states' income tax structures. Is that fair?
Yeah, there's a lot of concern about incentives these days and how they're used. And again, that's why we wanted a sustainable approach to Alabama's incentives. So what that study showed, and this was done by the Economic Development Partnership of Alabama, EDPA for short, they looked at what other states do relative to Alabama. Interestingly, if you took all incentives away, the tax structure in Alabama would be fairly competitive. We would be in the top 1 or 2 of those states that they ranked. But the reality is that we live in a competitive world, and
I remember you saying that. You said, "Look, I wish we didn't have to do this, but it's just the
reality,
way of the world."
And interestingly, we don't compete just against 49 other states. We are also competing against other countries. Alabama is an international attractor of international investment into our state. So there's a lot of competition. So our incentives, once you do layer them back in relative to other states' incentive programs, hey, we're not number one. We don't have the most aggressive incentive program out there, and I don't think we have to be, but we certainly want to be in the top third, and that's where our incentives put us. So it allows us to compete.
I know that these are up for reauthorization this year. You're seeking some changes, which, look, 5 years goes by, the economy changes. But what are the specific changes you are seeking in this next legislative session to these incentives bills?
Yeah, so when we created, July of 2015 is when we created these new incentives. That's when we really changed everything and went with a more sustainable pay-as-you-go approach. We operate under 2 limitations, 2 restraints, if you will. One is a cap. So we have a cap currently, and we are bumping into that cap now. So it's already impeding our ability to compete today. So we've got to address, as we reauthorize this program, we've got to address the cap and see that cap. Because it's pay-as-you-go, I would suggest that we could eliminate the cap, because a cap is really unnecessary, because if a company doesn't perform, they don't get paid an incentive. And we've got the data because we've actually been working in what we call a compliance environment. So as companies are actually giving us their compliance reports, and we've got the data that backs up what they have committed to in a contract called a project agreement, if they don't meet those restrictions and goals and commitments under that contract, we don't pay them for that year. So again, it's self-policing. So a cap really is not necessary, but I understand that there are some in the legislature who feel caps are necessary. So we will seek to either remove the cap or have a discussion about other alternatives. The other limitation that we've got is a sunset date. The program is currently scheduled to sunset July 31st of 2023. That's just around the corner. The last time we approached the legislature, they gave us a 2-year extension. We believe that we've got proof in the data that we've been able to show the Legislative Oversight Committee and this new joint committee on incentives that we just reported to, that you brought up earlier. We've got the proof that shows that these are sustainable, so we're going to request a 5-year extension on that sunset date.
What feedback are you hearing? Do you think there's an appetite to, do the changes that you're seeking?
Well, look, I think that that goes back to how are these incentives performing, and I think that in reality the proof is in the numbers. We've got the data that shows, that when we approached this program, we were looking at 3 overarching goals. One was to stimulate new capital investment in the state, which brings to expanding new jobs, and it creates new careers and diversifies our economy. The second goal was to generate new revenue streams into the state to support education and general government. And then thirdly was to positively impact per capita income for Alabamians. So the proof in the data is showing that we are achieving those things. So since July of 2015, the Alabama Jobs Act incentives have allowed us to attract over $17 billion of new investment into the state, creating about 34,000 jobs. And that's coming from just under 200 projects since July of 15 through the end of 2021. What's probably more impressive than that is that the data capture from our compliance system shows that we are achieving that rise in per capita income. We're actually seeing Jobs Act incentivized jobs that are producing wages that are 31% higher than Alabama's median wage currently. And we're achieving a positive return on that incentive investment of 168%. That's pretty powerful. When you look at our economy, I don't think anybody can argue unemployment's at historical lows. We've got more people employed today than we've ever had in our state's history. So the signs are all good. This program is working. So I think that we're going to see a lot of interest in reauthorizing the Alabama Jobs Act and growing Alabama. And I think that the proof is going to be once we get legislation drafted and go before the Joint Legislative Committee on Incentives, making our recommendation. Hopefully they will embrace those recommendations, and then we'll take it to the legislature.
We will certainly be following that. It's a very important subject. While I have you, I wanted to ask you about inflation. It's still around, still at kind of historic highs. It's a problem for just everyday people when they go to the grocery store. Same thing with gas prices. But when it comes to economic development, I mean, it seems to me that there might be some economic uncertainty. So does inflation affect a company's decision to expand and maybe even locate here? Are you hearing that from recruiting? Trail?
Yeah, we're in a non-traditional economy setup right now, because if you look back at history, typically high inflation has led to recessionary pressures. High wages, high consumer prices have traditionally stifled consumer spending, and we all know that the U.S. economy is really based on consumer spending, as is our state to a large degree. And interestingly, wages continue to rise, even with inflationary pressures at historic highs. We see inflation that we've never seen since the 80s. People are still spending. Is that impacting companies? There's some interesting things afoot today. We're seeing larger projects with higher capital investment that are moving around the globe and the U.S. Some of this has to do with the electrification of vehicles and the massive investment being made in that technology. But there are other companies that we see that are being impacted by the uncertainty. So I think while we can pinpoint that there are certain sectors that are continuing to be robust, as we say, in project activity, there are other sectors that are beginning to say, maybe we need to wait and see because our cost of capital is rising.
Some uncertainty there. Well, before I let you go, I wanted to ask, I knew you were down at Cape Canaveral for the planned launch, I guess a couple of planned launches.
That's right.
But I mean, look, this is a big moment for Alabama. So many companies located here, Marshall Space Flight Center, there in Huntsville, lots of contributions from this state to the space program.
Yeah, Alabama is definitely a state that has a rich heritage in the U.S. Space environment and sector. I was there. My wife and I went as guests invited by NASA, the Marshall Space Flight Center, which plays a huge role in the SLS system as part of the Artemis mission programs. So this was for the launch of Artemis 1. This is the first in the missions of Artemis. This is a test flight of the new rocket. We went for the first launch, which was scrubbed. We went back for the second launch, which was scrubbed. We were there on state business on the first launch, but hey, we're invested now, so we paid our own dime to go back for the second launch, and unfortunately, it was scrubbed too. But you want to get it right. So I respect the fact that with the safety measures in place and the importance of this launch for all of humankind, returning humans back to the moon, using the moon and a new platform that will orbit the moon as the next launching station to get humans to Mars, is all very important, and I'm so happy to see Alabama playing such a critical role in that.
Well, maybe third time will be the charm.
That's what I believe. Third time is the charm.
Mr. Secretary, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much.
We'll be right back.
The 375,000 acres that make up the 3 ranger districts of Talladega National Forest were purchased by the federal government in 1936 as part of an effort to restore clear-cut timberlands and farmlands no longer capable of producing crops. The beautiful reserve includes the 102-mile Pinhoti National Trail System and Alabama's highest and second highest points, Mount Cheaha and Duggar Mountain.
Next, I'm joined by State Senator Clay Scofield, Majority Leader for the Alabama Senate. Senator, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to have you on specifically to talk about broadband. You've been one of the key advocates for expanding access, especially in rural areas, to high-speed broadband internet. And now we're starting to see this happen. Last week, these grants were announced, $26 million through ADECA, that will go to companies to help them expand fiber lines to rural communities. Were you happy to see this finally kind of get off the ground?
Yes, and it represents years of hard work by a lot of people, and certainly the new broadband division that we established over at ADECA. They have been hiring up and staffing that new division, and of course we have been investing some 20-25 million a year in this leading up to this, so we know what works and what doesn't, and so the latest grants represented sort of a continuation of what we have been doing. But when you're talking about a $4 to $6 billion problem, 25 million a year is going to be very slow. Now, obviously, that is a match, so the ISPs or the internet service providers provide the bulk of the funding. So 25 million is an actual multiplier. But when we really will begin to see an impact is in the money that we appropriated from ARPA, the $191 million for last mile, and then the $85 million for middle mile.
I was going to ask you about that. When the subject of broadband comes up, you hear last mile, you hear middle mile. Could you kind of explain what those terms mean and why they're important?
Absolutely. So the middle mile, the legislature, obviously with the support of Governor Ivey, we appropriated $85 million for middle mile program. Now, envision a middle mile program would be about like an interstate system, a very high speed interstate system around the state of Alabama. And this will virtually touch almost every county in the state of Alabama the way this is laid out. That will basically be we put out RFPs for that. Companies bid on it, submitted proposals, and we are taking the best submission, doing it for the least amount of money, and so that will be a sole-owned company, and they will be essentially like a wholesaler. Those lines won't actually go into the home. That is last mile, getting it to the home.
Kind of like an artery versus smaller veins and capillaries.
Yeah, this is a huge deal for Alabama. This will put us really at the forefront on broadband in Alabama, and it will help us to expand quicker, much quicker, and much more affordable, I should add. From there, we had appropriated $191 million for the last mile. So hopefully we're very close to being able to award the middle mile program, and it will immediately begin construction, so that hopefully in the the spring, we'll be ready to award the last mile grants, so that middle mile structure can hopefully be out there enough that we're able to make the 191 million go further and get out there quicker.
How much of this broadband expansion is triage, meaning like are the worst in need first in line, or is there a waiting list of sorts? How do you go about determining who gets the first grants?
We have a list of criteria that are laid down in the law, and of course, we set minimum speeds in the law at 100 over 100. I mean, we're going fast. If we're investing public dollars, we need to future-proof it as much as we can. Obviously, technology changes every day, and 100 over 100 in 10 years may be slow, but through that list of criteria, they are competitive grants. So we want to see that they are able to hook up more people who have nothing as cheaply as possible. Mm-hmm. And so those competitive grant scheme is how it's done.
I see. Switching gears a bit, it's election season, and there's going to be, no matter what shakes out in November, the Senate's going to look a lot different. The legislature in general, maybe not as different as the House, but Senate's you have some new faces. I would imagine new committee chairs, new people trying to move up. How does your caucus go about deciding, who gets the committee chair, who gets in leadership? Is there I guess it's an internal process.
It is an internal process, and to your point, we will have 4 new Republican faces in the Senate and 2 new Democrat faces in the Senate, which, for my 3 terms is really the lowest amount of turnover that we've had in 1 year. Usually it's been, 8 to 12. I think my class was 12 new Republicans or so, and then I think the next was maybe 8. And so it is a smaller group. The challenge with that is we have a very limited amount of chairmanships available, and yet every one of them are extremely capable of being very, very good chairmen. And so, obviously the Senate is very seniority based. Your time and your experience in the Senate is certainly taken into account. Being frankly, good to work with, and team players, and folks that are dedicated to their constituency and things like that are seriously taken into account. Obviously, the different committees are, represent different aspects of Alabama life, and from the Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry Committee to the Judiciary Committee to our budgets and confirmations and so on, banking and insurance, so on and so forth. And so, having chairmen with backgrounds in those areas are very, very important. And naturally, the folks that begin to jockey for those and push for those usually have a background in those areas. So chairmanships aside, the sort of the committee structure reflects that as well. People who maybe have backgrounds in certain areas definitely want to be present on certain committees, and so that's taken into heavy account, because we need the experience and expertise when we're trying to sort through the bills and what's good and bad, and make the committee process work is very important. And so, our process is within the next month or so, we'll send out a formal letter to our members, and we're already asking them to kind of jot down what their interests are, committee-wise and chairmanship-wise, and both standing and non-standing committees. And then once our formal process begins, we'll just ask them to sort of put it in more formal asks in letter format so that we can keep track and then begin to put the very difficult puzzle together. Because again, we have a lot of with current freshmen who will have some seniority at that time and very limited amount of chairmanships, and frankly every single one of them would make a fantastic chairman. So it's going to be difficult, but we're up to the task and going to be fair and do what's best for that senator, their constituents in the state of Alabama.
We always like the inside baseball, so thanks for walking me through that. We're out of time, but I hope you'll come back and talk some more.
Anytime.
Thanks again.
You got it.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capital Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capital Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capital Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capital Journal podcasts. Keep up with what's happening with Capital Journal.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for watching. A programming note for next week. We are airing a special episode of Capital Journal dedicated to the issue of opioid addiction, particularly prevention and treatment. That will air next Friday night right here on Alabama Public Television. For our Capital Journal team, I'm Todd Stacy. We'll see you next time.